Recording in progress.
Okay. All right. This week's Sedra Parshas Lecha, and the first pasuk in Parshas Lecha is Vayomer Hashem al Avraham. God says to Avraham, Lech Lecha, go for yourself. Me'artzecha, from your land. Moladatcha. Well, there's all kinds of discussions of what the meaning of Moladatcha is, but I guess the safest explanation, without getting involved in Machlokas Rishonim, would be from the place of your relatives. Umi beis abicha, and from your father's house. El Eretz asher areka, to the land that I will show you. And Rashi, the first Rashi says, Lech Lecha. Rashi focuses on the double expression, Lech Lecha. So Rashi says, go for yourself. What does it mean, go for yourself? If it would just say Lech, that would be good enough. So Rashi says that it means Lahanoscha letovascha. In other words, go for your own benefit and for your own good. So Rashi says, it's based on the Medrash, Bisham, in that land that I will show you, Escha, I will make you L'goy Gadol, either a big or a great nation. B'kan iyata zocha levanim. But here, outside the land that I will take you, you are not going to merit to have descendants, to have children. Biod sho'odia tivacha ba'ola. And furthermore, I will spread your fame throughout the world as a result of your going to Eretz Yisrael. It seems that Rashi is not just telling us that Avraham is being told that he will get a certain reward, but he's being told that he is going to have descendants. He's being told that he's going to have descendants, and that his name or his fame will be made known throughout the world, is directly connected with his going to Eretz Yisrael, independent of it being a reward, a possible reward for him to go there. Now we have to understand what the connection is between, in regard to the command that God told Avraham to go to the land that will show him, which is Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and the having of children, descendants, actually in an almost miraculous manner, and making his name known throughout the world. Now, the Rashi, El Eretz asher areka, God said to Avraham that you leave your father's house, your birthplace, or your family, your relatives' place, the city of your relatives, your father's house, your land. Rashi says, but he says, El Eretz asher areka, the land that I will show you. He doesn't mention where, just the land that I will show you. Lo gil lo haretz miyad, kidei lechavava be'enav, to make it desirable, or to make it beloved to him. V'lo seis lo schar, and to give him a reward. I'll call dibor v'dibor kayotze. I'll call dibor v'dibor, in order to give him a reward for every expression. Now, as far as the second half of Rashi is concerned, it's very easy to understand. In other words, God could have told Avraham, go to the land of Israel. But he said, leave your land leave the place of your relatives and leave your father's house. Instead of just saying, go to the land of Israel. So in other words, instead of it being one command, he gave 3 separate commands. And since it was 3 separate commands, by adhering to those 3 commands, Avraham got a greater reward. Okay, that needs to be understood. But then the question is, how is it that, but the first half of Rashi is very strange, that because God didn't tell him where he's taking him, so that would make Eretz Yisrael more chaviv, more beloved to him, more desirable to him. How are we to understand that? Now, in regard to the second half of Rashi, I saw brought down in the name of Reb Chaim, that Reb Chaim said that if you look at the 3 terms, Lecha, me'artzecha, u'me'meuladetcha, u'mibeis avicha, from your father's house, leave your land, leave the city of your relatives, and leave your father's house. So it's actually in opposite order. It should have said first, Lech lecha, leave your father's house. Secondly, it should have said, leave the city, and then leave the country. When we take a trip, we leave our house first, then we leave the city. Let's say we're going to another land, then we leave our city, and then we go to another country, we leave our country. So here it is in opposite order. The question is, why is it in opposite order? So Reb Chaim said, and he was explaining to Rashi, it was in opposite order in order to emphasize that it's 3 separate commandments. In other words, you could say that God told Avraham, leave your father's house, leave your city, and leave your land, but it's all part of one command. Start the trip, continue the trip, and arrive at your destination. So the fact that they put it in the opposite order was to emphasize the point that it was a separate command. Okay, but that doesn't explain how Eretz Yisrael becomes chaviv, becomes beloved, something desirable to Avraham. Now, years ago, I suggested that the reason, it's a little different than Rashi, the reason the Torah doesn't tell us which land, that God didn't tell Avraham, which land he was telling Avraham to go, El Eretz Asher Echa, the land that I'll show you, was in order that Avraham, in order to emphasize to Avraham that there are many benefits in Eretz Yisrael. It's true, there might be many benefits in Eretz Yisrael. But when you go to Eretz Yisrael, you should go, ideally, you should go to Eretz Yisrael because you're fulfilling a command of God. I was talking to my brother, Reb Chaim, on the phone this morning. So he mentioned to me that the Beis Halevi says the mitzvah of Amunah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be filled not just because intellectually we recognize the existence of God and everything that God does, but the reason is because it was done as a command. So but to me it seems that a person could possibly, although that's not the main explanation that I'm going to offer today, but we could suggest that going to Eretz Yisrael was, God emphasized to Avraham, going to Eretz Yisrael was had greater chavivus, because it involved fulfilling more commands of God. In other words, we should read the pasuk. The pasuk should be in the following manner: Lech lecha mi'artzecha el aretz asher eka. Go from your land to the land that I'll show you. Go to the land. Leave your father's house to the land that I'll show you. Leave the city of your family and go to the land that I'll show you. And leave your country and go to the land that I'll show you. So for Avraham, it was involved extra chavivus because it involved more commandments, fulfilling more mitzvos. So that's perhaps the reason why. But I want to suggest that perhaps we could suggest a different explanation. Now, the Kafta V'Ferach, that was a sefer of a Rishon, and it dealt with the laws of Eretz Yisrael. The Kafta V'Ferach raises the question. We know that the way we paskin, during the first Commonwealth, until Nebuchadnezzar sent the Jews into exile, Babylonian exile, so Eretz Yisrael had the sanctification that was endowed on it by Yehoshua, by Joshua. But and then that dusha, that sanctification, when they went into Babylonian exile, disappeared. Eretz Yisrael ceased to have the sanctification that it received from the capture of Yehoshua, the capture of Joshua. And it was only re-sanctified when Ezra, at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth, returned to Eretz Yisrael. So the Kafta Ferach raises the question, and he says, is it possible to assume that Eretz Yisrael, during that 70-year period of exile, was like any other land, since it didn't have its Kedusha? Obviously not. He says, we know, would there be a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, of living in Eretz Yisrael during those 70 years? We know that Eretz Yisrael is a skula. It has a positive impact for those who are buried there. So you mean to say during those 70 years, when Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who were buried in Hebron, it was not a special place, especially in view of the fact that Yaakov wanted to be buried in Eretz Yisrael long before Eretz Yisrael was sanctified. So the Kafta V'Ferach says, he says Eretz Yisrael really has two sanctifications. One sanctification is the Kedusha for mitzvos. We have mitzvah of Trumos, Maestro, Shemitah, mitzvahs Hatuyas Baretz, mitzvahs that are dependent upon the land. And that Kedusha, that sanctification, is dependent upon the Jewish people residing in the land. However, there is another Kedusha in Eretz Yisrael, another sanctification in Eretz Yisrael. And that sanctification is the Kedushas HaShechina, the presence of God in the land of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, God is everywhere, but we are more sensitive to his presence. We can be more sensitive to his presence in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. And when did Eretz Yisrael get this sanctification? The Kafta V'Ferach says, when Avraham came to Eretz Yisrael, That's when Eretz Yisrael got that sanctification. And that sanctification, the Captain of Parach says, is a permanent sanctification. Even when the Jewish people went to exile, the presence of the Shekhinah never ceased to be in Eretz Yisrael. And my grandfather suggested something very similar, but a little different. He says that besides the Dushas Aretz, the sanctification of the land, which makes the land required in Trumos, Maisro, Shemitah, the mitzvos that have to do with giving parts of the crop to the Kohanim, to the Leviim, to be eaten in Yerushalayim, to the poor. It has another status. It had a status what my grandfather would call Shem Eretz Yisrael, the status of Eretz Yisrael. What does Eretz Yisrael mean? Eretz Yisrael means the land that belongs to the Jewish people. Eretz Yisrael belongs to the Jewish people, not just to the Jewish people of one particular generation, but to the Jewish people of all generations. Let's say if all the Jews would contribute $1 and buy up some section, let's say section Chicago, West Rogers Park, let be Skokie, whatever section it is, it still wouldn't become Eretz Yisrael because they would be partners. But it wouldn't belong to the Jewish people as a nation, as one unit. The only place that belongs to the Jewish people as a nation, as one unit, and the Jewish people of all generations, that's Eretz Yisrael. That's the land of Israel. And when was that land given over to the Jewish people? In the time of Avraham Avinu, when Abraham entered Eretz Yisrael. Now, so the Rambam, it's well known, I've discussed it many times, and I'll probably discuss it many more times. The Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvos, he delineates the 613 mitzvos, but he doesn't mention the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz, the mitzvah of conquering Eretz Yisrael, and the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. And the Ramban strongly disagrees with the Rambam. And he says that there is a mitzvah of conquering Eretz Yisrael and living in Eretz Yisrael. V'yirashtem es haaretz v'yashavtem ba. You shall live in the land and dwell therein. Now, the Ramban, who says that there is a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael in his Perush and Chumash. Well, so from the Ramban and Sefer Mitzvahs, he seems to say, why is there a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael? Because Eretz Yisrael was the land that God gave to the Avos, that gave to the patriarchs, that promised that the Jewish people, that will be the land of the descendants of the patriarchs. So from the words of the Ramban in Sefer HaMitzvos, it appears that the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is based on the fact that the land of Eretz Yisrael was given to the Jewish people. It's the possession of the Jewish people in one unit because it was given to them. They inherited from the patriarchs. However, the Ramban in Chumash, when he discusses the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, there's the mitzvah of dwelling in Eretz Yisrael. He brings as proof the fact that the Gemara in Ksuva says that a person could use monetary pressure in regard to the Ksuva. A person could use pressure to get under laboratory conditions to encourage their spouse. And it works both ways. The husband can encourage the wife to go to Eretz Yisrael. The wife can encourage the husband. but it's only if they go together. So to move to Eretz Yisrael. So so if they go together, the one can force the other. And the Gemara in Yishuv says that this is true not just in regard to Eretz Yisrael, but one spouse could pressure in the same manner the other spouse to move to Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem. So the question is, if this is proof, this law is proof that there is a mitzvah, a requirement, according to Ramban, to live in Eretz Yisrael. So since the same halacha applies and said together with the mitzvah in regard to living in Jerusalem, we should say that there is a mitzvah to live in Jerusalem. And why would that be? V'yirashtem es haaretz v'yishavtem ba does not single out Jerusalem. So how are we to understand it? But I think the way we could understand it is that there are actually two mitzvahs of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. One mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael is because Eretz Yisrael was the land that was given to Avraham, to the patriarchs, for the Jewish people of all generations. That's one mitzvah. But then there's another mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and that's to dwell together with the Shekhinah, to dwell with the presence of God. And since the presence of God is greater in Jerusalem than anywhere else, so not that it's necessarily a requirement, but one performs that mitzvah in a greater manner by going to Jerusalem, because the Shekhinah, the presence of God, is more apparent in Jerusalem. Now, however, we could even say it a little differently, and we could say it's really one mitzvah. The mitzvah is a mitzvah of showing, demonstrating the relationship between God and the Jewish people. In other words, in living in the place that God gave over to the Jewish people and where he made his presence more apparent. In other words, God made his presence more apparent than the land that he was giving over to the Jewish people in order to demonstrate the relationship between God and the Jewish people. Now, the question is, the Rambam's opinion is that there is no requirement to live in the land of Eretz Yisrael, but as my father said, that there isn't a required mitzvah, but the one who does live in Eretz Yisrael is fulfilling a voluntary mitzvah. But the mitzvahs in the Sefer Mitzvahs, in the delineation of 613 mitzvahs, it's not talking about voluntary mitzvahs. It's talking about required mitzvahs. Now, however, there are many other answers to this question. But I just want to discuss one of them because we won't have time to discuss all the other answers or many of the other answers. I want to discuss the answer. It's attributed to many different people. Some attributed to Rav Kook, some attributed to Eim Habanim. It's a sefer that was written by someone who a Hungarian gadol who went through the war. He died at the end of the war, and initially was opposed to the Zionist movement, but during the war, he regretted the previous attitude that he had, and he spoke how important Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is. But what they say, it's all based on the Orach Chaim and Chumash. The Orach Chaim and Chumash in Parshas Matos, he says, the end of Matos. No, excuse me. In the end of Parshas Nitzavim. At the end of Parshas Nitzavim, so the Orach Chaim says that the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah hakoleles kol haTorah kula. It's a mitzvah that includes all the mitzvahs of the Torah. Now the Rambam says that he makes rules of what type of mitzvahs he includes in the 613 mitzvahs. And when it comes to the fourth rule is that a mitzvah that includes the whole Torah is not counted as a mitzvah. For example, the Doshin Tiyu, you should be holy. Ram holds that's not a separate mitzvah. How is one kadosh? The other explanations are given. But the Rambam understood Doshin Tiyu, fulfill the mitzvahs of the Torah. Every time the Torah says fulfill the mitzvahs of the Torah, it's not counted as a separate mitzvah. So some of the Achronim say that the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, is a mitzvah that's kol Torah kula, that includes the whole Torah. And they base it on many different things. There's a famous Ramban. The Ramban says that we should observe the mitzvahs of the Torah. It seems there it's talking about the positive commandments. We should observe the mitzvahs of the Torah in Chutz La'aretz, in exile, in order that we should remember them in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, the ultimate giving of the mitzvahs was for them to be observed in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, that's still difficult, but you still have to observe it outside Eretz Yisrael. And more than that, a mitzvah called, why is it a mitzvah that includes the whole Torah is not counted as a separate mitzvah? Because it's not adding anything. It only has reference to what was already mentioned. Observe the Torah. But here, there's an added aspect to the mitzvah, and that is to do the mitzvah in Eretz Yisrael. So we have to say that those who had this opinion, they felt that every mitzvah, and this has a basis in the Ramban, every mitzvah is a mitzvah, not just to, let's say, putting on tefillin. It's a mitzvah of putting on tefillin, and especially in Eretz Yisrael. And we have to say that they held that in regard to the prohibitions, don't eat something that's not kosher, but especially in Eretz Yisrael, don't. It's more chamor if you do it in Eretz Yisrael. So every mitzvah on a higher level is in Eretz Yisrael, and every sin is on a lower level if you do it in Eretz Yisrael. So even that is very, very difficult. But that's how we would have to understand this opinion. What is this opinion based on? It's based on the fact that the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, is a mitzvah of having a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Sense being in the place where you're able to sense the presence of God, not just sense His presence, but sense the relationship that you have with Him. And in a sense, the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is having a certain type of relationship with God. And consequently, the mitzvah, according to them, and I still find it very difficult, the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah of having a special relationship with God. Now, and it's very interesting. I remember many years ago when I was a boy, so my father's house, I don't have it now, there was a siddur from Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And in the siddur from Rabbi Yaakov Emden talks about the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden says, of course, living in Eretz Yisrael, living in the land of Israel is a great mitzvah. He says, but that's only if you can observe the mitzvahs of the Torah. He said, but if you're not going to observe the mitzvahs of the Torah, who asked you to trample on my courtyard? God says. In other words, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, that's a big chiddush. In other words, Rabbi Yaakov Emden also understood the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as dwelling, as having a relationship, a special relationship with God. But if you're not going to observe the mitzvahs of the Torah, so on the contrary, it's a negation. It's worse in Eretz Yisrael than in Chutz La'aretz. So in other words, Rabbi Yaakov Emden understood the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as a mitzvah that has to do with having a certain close relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he says that if you don't do the mitzvahs of Torah, it's like rebelling in God's face. So now we could suggest, so in other words, all of these opinions is based on the fact that the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is not just dwelling in the land, but it's having a special relationship with God. Now we could say that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us in the Torah, the mitzvos, in a sense, we are shlichim of God. We are agents of God. And we are entrusted with a mission. And the fulfillment of the mitzvos are part of our mission. But there's a difference between when I am appointed as an agent, but the one who is appointed me comes with me to fulfill that mission, and when that person just sends me alone by myself. I think when God told Avraham Avinu, El Eretz Asher Areka, that I'll take you to the land that I'll show you, and he didn't tell him what the land was. So in a sense, God was saying, I am going along with you. You are not traveling alone. It's not like someone who tells me to go somewhere and says goodbye. No, I am coming with you. El Eretz Asher Areka, I am going with you. There will be a certain closeness between me and you when we travel to Eretz Yisrael. And not only that, but that closeness is not just something that'll be with you. I am going with you, and my presence will remain permanently in Eretz Yisrael. The Kedusha, the sanctification, as the Captain of Eretz says. The Kedusha Shechina, the sanctification of the presence of God. That is permanent in Eretz Yisrael from the time that Avraham Avinu went there. And that's why it was Chavivus. That's why it was, that mitzvah was beloved. Because Avraham Avinu knew that he wasn't traveling alone. He was traveling with God. And the purpose of his God traveling with him was for God to remain, the presence of God to remain in Eretz Yisrael. So now, And so this was, and Avram's going to Eretz Yisrael was a precedent for future generations and being together with the presence of God. Now, there's Rambam in the Geras Hashmat. It's a very interesting Rambam. The Rambam says that a person should always choose, a person has a choice between two cities. And he says, even if it's two cities of Jews, two Jewish cities, if a person has a choice between two cities, one where they're more observant and one where they're less observant. I'm not going to try to discuss what that means. One should choose to go to the city where they are more observant. And then the Ram says, and while this is true about two cities of Jews, it's certainly true about one city is not Jewish. One city, and especially there, it's talking about cities where the non-Jewish authorities did not let Jews observe mitzvos. So the Rambam says, if a person has a choice, if he has the ability, he has to go. He should go to a city that has people that are observing mitzvos. And the Rambam cites a pasuk. The expression of the Rambam in the Geras Kiddush Hashem is Shekol Hador Ben Hakofrim Shehu Kamosa. That if somebody lives among the Kofrim, the deniers, he becomes like them. Shekeno Mar David Hamelech, because King David said, Ki Gershuni Hayom Istapeach Benachas Hashem Lemor Lecha Bodol Kim Acherim. So they have driven me. David HaMelech said when he was pushed out because of Shaul from Eretz Yisrael, he said, they have driven me away this day from attaching myself to the heritage of God, as if to say, go worship the gods of others. Hinei shakal diroso ben hagayim. So David equated his living in non-Jewish areas as if he was worshiping idols. Now, but there seems to be a contradiction, because the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim, the Rambam there says that one should live in a city in Eretz Yisrael, even if the city is mostly non-Jews, and that is preferable to live in a city outside Eretz Yisrael, even if that city outside Eretz Yisrael, has mostly Jews. And what pasuk does he give? He gives the same pasuk. And he says, as David HaMelech said when he was chased out of Eretz Yisrael, in other words, when you leave Eretz Yisrael, it's like you are worshiping idols, not literally, but you are becoming part of a foreign culture. So it seems strange. On one hand, he says you should live in a city where he uses this pasuk that it tells us that you should live in a city where people are following tradition, where people are observant of the mitzvahs HaTorah. In the other case, in the Yad HaChazaka, he uses the same pasuk to say, live in a city in Eretz Yisrael. Even if there's mostly non-Jews there. In other words, if you have a choice between living in Borough Park or Ramallah, we're talking where you'll be able to survive in Ramallah, of course. So the Rambam in Yad HaChazaka says you should live in Ramallah. But but it would seem from the Igros Kiddush Hashem, that the Rambam is saying that on the contrary, you should live in the city where Jewish life is strongest. So how do we resolve this contradiction? And I think there's a difference between Jewish life in Eretz Yisrael and Jewish life in Chutz La'aretz. In Eretz Yisrael, when you live in Eretz Yisrael, even if you're one person in that city, but you're not just living with the Jews that are there or not there at that present time. You're living with the Jews of the generations before. You're living with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. You're living in the times of Yeshua. There is a connection in Eretz Yisrael. There is a connection of the generations. I would even suggest that it's possible that in Eretz Yisrael, there is a certain connection to the generations of Jews outside Eretz Yisrael. But certainly, there's a connection to the Jews who lived. Eretz Yisrael is a place where time, in a sense, ceases to exist. All of time comes together. But it's not, I want to suggest, so consequently, you live in the culture. We live in the United States. Our children they can go to day schools. But when Lincoln's birthday comes, and Lincoln was a great person, no question about it. So bring home a thing, some arts and craft project that looks like a log cabin, because Lincoln was born in a log cabin. And a father looking at it would suggest, because that's the time of the year that we read about the Mishkan. He might think, oh, my son is learning about the Mishkan. He said, no, it's Lincoln's log cabin. We all live in the culture of the country we are. You can live in Lakewood, you can live in Borough Park, we're all affected by that culture. I'm not saying that it's bad. For some of them, it might even be good. But we're living in the culture. When you live in Eretz Yisrael, you're living in the culture not just of the present. You're living in the culture of the past, of all the previous generations. And I want to suggest, and especially for Avraham Avinu, there was nothing in the past. Why does the Torah start with Lech Lecha? Why doesn't the Torah tell us about the Kibshon age where Avraham was thrown into the furnace? Torah is not coming to tell us the biography of Avraham. The Torah is coming to tell us about the foundation of the Jewish people, of the foundation of the Jewish nation. And that begins with Lech Lecha. Torah tells us about his birth otherwise. But in terms of what happened to Avraham, the Torah is telling us only about Avraham being the father of the Jewish people, the founder of the Jewish nation, if I can use that word. So so for all of us, when we live in Eretz Yisrael, we're not only living with the past generations, but perhaps in a more limited way, and perhaps in a more major way, we're living with the future generations as well. And that was certainly true in regard to Avraham. So, and we have to understand, because of that, when we deal with Eretz Yisrael, the place is a special obligation that when we deal with Eretz Yisrael, we're dealing with Eretz Yisrael not just for ourselves, but we're dealing with Eretz Yisrael for the past generations and the future generations also. In other words, we can't just focus when we think about possession of Eretz Yisrael and giving up territories. We have to focus not just on Eretz Yisrael for us, but we have to focus on Eretz Yisrael for future generations as well. Eretz Yisrael is not real estate. Eretz Yisrael is the home of the Jewish people of all generations. And I think this is the connection that Avraham was told Kan eina tazoch lebanim. But there you will have children. You will become a great nation. Because in Eretz Yisrael, Avraham wasn't just going with himself to Eretz Yisrael. Avraham was going with all future generations to Eretz Yisrael. And I think, as far as Lahodia Tivcha Ba'olam, if you take a look at all of Parshas Lech Lecha, the whole idea of Parshas Lech Lecha is separation. Lech Lecha me'artzecha mimladcha beis avicha. Leave your father's house. Leave the land that you lived in. And then Avraham separates from Lot. Not that he didn't care about Lot. He cared about Lot. He runs. He sacrifices his life to save Lot. But he has to separate. And the whole idea of bris milah is that, in other words, it was that he had to be different. And in Parshas Chayesara, you see the Bnei Ches said, all the nations wanted Avraham to be associated. We want you to be identified with us. They had gave great regard for him. But to Avraham, there was a question. How should he spread the truth? How should he spread knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Does he spread it by being one of them? Or does he spread it by starting his own nation, separate from them? In terms of the long-term influence, maybe in the short-term influence, it would be a greater influence being part of them. But Parshas Lech Lecha is the idea of separation. The long-term influence, then the impact would have been very temporary. We're only to have a long-term influence because we are a separate nation. And that was the idea of Eretz Yisrael. The idea of Eretz Yisrael was from the perspective of future generations, that we should create a separate nation. We are a nation outside Eretz Yisrael. We're a nation because of the Torah. But if there wasn't an Eretz Yisrael, it would be difficult for us to be recognized as a separate nation. The nations of the world have all been influenced over generations by the Jewish people, even those that hate the Jewish people, those that have become the biggest enemies of the Jewish people. But nevertheless, as the Rambam says, many of the religions among the nations of the world came about in order to bring the people closer to the idea of monotheism, the recognition of one God. And that's the B'nai B'chori Yisrael. That was something that they learned from the Jewish people. So, Lo'odia Tivcha Ba'olam, to make your reputation well known, is in terms not just of well known now, and it probably was true then also. Tivcha Ba'olam is you have to be a different nation. So long as he was together with the place where his relatives were, he would be identified with them. In order to have start his own nation, he had to remove himself from his parents' home, from his relatives. And in Eretz Canaan, he was able, even though the Canaanim were there, by Canaan Yaz Baretz, nevertheless, he was able to start his own nation. And he was able to have not just an influence on his generation, but an influence on all the generations that came after him. Okay.
Is anyone, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. So this isn't giving another answer to why he used 3 commands. Your family, your house, your father's house, your family.
So
and-
I could suggest that it gives it is a command. Why there? Well, 3 commands. That's in order to give more schar. That's first of all, because he mentions 2 things. He mentions schar and he mentions to make it chavit. So that's one thing, and we could say that we have to understand the pasuk Lecha me'artzecha el haaretz asher areka, Lech lecha mimoladcha el haaretz asher areka. So to a certain degree, we could say that those family feelings, HaKadosh Baruch Hu replaced them with the closeness to Him,
being close to Hashem.
closeness to Hashem. But you don't have to say that. You could say that's a separate question and a separate answer. In other words, because the Rashi says 2 things. First of all, you have more schar, more reward, and so there was more command, and the other thing was that the other thing was that it'll be chavit, 2 separate things.
Is a sin committed in Israel worse? Is doing the same thing somewhere else?
Certainly according to Rabbi Yaakov Emden.
If someone couldn't, if someone is not able to make a living in Israel, but they are able to make a living in Chutz La'aretz, should they still move to Israel? Is there still a priority to go there?
I don't know what it means to make a living, but it's certainly if a person's making sacrifices, yeah. But if a person but there is a halacha that you don't have to give more than a chomish of your wealth for a mitzvah saseh. The chomish of your wealth doesn't have to mean a chomish of your wealth, 1/5 of your wealth, doesn't necessarily mean a 50 wealth. 50 wealth means that's when it's considered a great hardship, an extremely great hardship. So if it's an extremely great hardship, then you don't have to go to Eretz Yisrael if you're not able to make a living, But you have to understand, what does it mean to make a living? Making a living doesn't mean that you have to build a house with a swimming pool.
If a spouse has a duty to persuade the other spouse to go to Israel, what about if there's I don't understand this question.
Okay, so I can't answer it.
Yeah.
In other words, let me, probably because I didn't explain the halacha. The halacha is that if a spouse divorces another spouse, so if the husband has to pay a certain amount of money equal to the ksuba, whatever the amount might be. So the halacha is that, let's say one spouse wants to go to Israel and the other spouse doesn't want to go. Let's say the husband wants to go to Israel and the wife refuses to go. Then the husband, under laboratory conditions, then the husband doesn't have to pay the ksuba to the wife if she refuses to accompany him to Eretz Yisrael. And the same thing, if the wife wants to go to Eretz Yisrael and the husband doesn't want to go to Eretz Yisrael, so the wife can divorce him, can insist that he divorce her, and she receives her ksuba.
Okay, this question is not related to the share.
Okay. The person can call me.
Okay.
I'll gladly. I'll try to answer.
Okay, so no more questions here. So everyone have a good week. Eshkach, thank you for the share and thank everyone for being here.